All right, Jean. Listen, I am looking forward to this because I have known Andy Rothman since my early days at CLSA. We actually overlapped for about a year before I left. I went to the buy side, and he is somebody who, I guess, from a Wall Street standpoint, I don't think too many people know China as well as Andy. I mean, you've had some interactions with him. I think he's pretty sharp.
Yeah, he's a genuine expert, and he has strong views, sometimes controversial, and so it'd be super interesting to get his take on all this amazing stuff that's taking place right now.
Today, I mean, even with the strength in the U.S., emerging markets have done extremely well. And if you look at the EM index, EEM, which is what everyone still looks at, China's been the big one of the big movers within that, and it's
Yeah.
been mainly, obviously, you mentioned the tech stocks, but um, the potential outperformance could be significant if somehow a deal comes through, which I think China needs because the local economy, the real estate consumer is dead. I mean, the AI stocks are leading the way, the technology stocks, but the economy itself, the real estate market is still dead, and that's something. Hopefully, we'll get Andy to comment on. At least that's the perception that most, let's say, people that don't have Andy's connections. Just look at the statistics. The real estate market continues to be
Yeah.
in the doldrums, which is the engine has been the engine for GDP growth for 25 years.
Yeah, the question that I have, and I hope that Andy has a strong opinion on this, is does she really care about the economy? Um, my my guess is no. He cares about other things. He's been perfectly willing to let the real estate sector collapse now for an extended period of time. Um, his priorities are in my view, very much on promotion, catching up on frontier industries, or really becoming a leader in frontier industries, and building up the military so that it's
All right.
so that it's basically it can isolate itself from any possible U.S. Moves on that on that part. So,
And Andy's
so
here.
maybe he's just willing to see the economy collapse. Uh, that's possible.
Andy, how are you?
I'm good. Good to see you guys.
Good to see
Hey,
you
Andy,
again.
great to see you.
Andy, we've just been chatting, obviously, about our favorite subject, China, and we're going to get into a lot of that. But what I always try to do is give a brief bio of the speakers, and even though we know you very well, a lot of the audience may not. So I'm going to jump into that, Andy, and then I'm going to barrage you with the first question, and we'll get going. So
Okay.
thanks again. Andy Rothman is the founder of is it Synology? Am I pronouncing that right, Andy?
Sure.
Synology advisory company focused on helping institutional investors and enterprises understand the business risk opportunities in China. Andy is a senior fellow at the Asia Society in Northern California. And prior to starting Synology, Andy was the China investment strategist at Matthews International Capital Management, a large active investment fund focused on investing in Asia and emerging markets. Prior to that, Andy was a China macro strategist at CLSA. Both John and I were clients of you back then, Andy, which is an Asia-focused investment bank, and we were certainly active clients of that company. And actually, I think we overlapped for about a year before I was at CLSA for a short period of time before I went to the buy side. Andy, you started your career. You spent 17 years in foreign service as a foreign service officer with the State Department, working for a time in the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. And actually, I just realized as well, you were on the Taiwan desk in D.C. Maybe we can jump into that a little bit. Andy, Andy lived and worked in China for over 20 years at different times, and is regarded, I can tell you this, by the finance community, institutional finance community, as one of the leading voices on China economics and strategy. And I believe your first trip to China was in 1980, Andy. I don't want to date you, but
You just did. Yeah.
all right. Andy, the first question is an easy one, Andy. Tell us what's going to happen when Trump and Mr. Xi get together in, I don't know, within 2 weeks sometime. No one knows the exact date. What's your view? Let's get started with that since that's currently happening and everyone seems to be focused on it.
So you're gonna start with a hard question. I thought we were gonna ease into this with something about the Wham concert in Guangzhou in 1984. All right. So good. I want to point out that we're talking on October 21st, and so it's roughly a week ahead of when Donald Trump and Xi Jinping are expected to meet on the margins of the APEC meeting in Korea. Of course, in this administration in Washington, nothing is ever certain, even after it happens. But it does look like the meeting is going to go ahead. President Trump just earlier today said that it's very likely. He did throw in there in his off-the-cuff remarks that, well, maybe it won't happen if somebody gets nasty, but then he said it's probably going to happen. So it certainly sounds to me like Donald Trump wants this meeting to take place and wants it to be successful. And I spent most of September in China, and my takeaway from meetings there, including about 10 days in Beijing, is that Xi Jinping wants this meeting to take place. Both sides have strong self-interest in not only a meeting, but a deal. So if you like, I can take a minute or two to explain what that self-interest is on both sides. On the US side, I think Donald Trump's looking at a few things. One is, even though he doesn't like to admit it in public, the tariffs are slowly, incrementally building up to a negative impact, both on inflation and unemployment in the United States. It's not terrible yet, but it's mounting. Certainly, if you read the Fed Beige Book reports on their interviews with companies around the country, you can see that things are only going to get worse. Because right now, the average effective tariff rate that American companies and consumers are paying is about 18%. That's the highest since the mid-1930s. For goods coming from China, it's 58%. And that's a significant share of US imports. So it's inescapable that this is going to have a material impact on the US economy. And that impact is going to continue to get worse as we get closer to the midterm elections next year. I think this is a significant motivator for Donald Trump. The other motivating factor is less concrete, but it's President Trump's eagerness to get the Nobel Peace Prize. And the more deals he accomplishes, I think in his mind, the better for that option to take place. Plus, he just seems to have not only a warm spot in his heart for TikTok, those are his words, but he seems to have a warm spot in his heart for Xi Jinping as well. And so he speaks more positively and constructively about Xi Jinping than any other world leader right now. It used to be a tie with Putin, but not anymore. And so I think all of these things together indicate that he really wants and hopes that he's going to be able to get a deal. Today, he said he expects a deal. He wants a deal that's good for China as long as it's fair for the United States. And that's not something he often says about other countries when he's talking about deals. From the Chinese side, I don't think Xi Jinping feels like he's under any great pressure to do a deal, but there are obvious self-interests for him. The most important one is that the Chinese economy is decent, but it's not great. It's moving at a pace well below potential. And the primary reason for this, in my view, is that there has been a collapse in confidence among Chinese consumers and Chinese entrepreneurs in their view of how the government's managing the economy and the direction of the economy. Most of this fall in confidence is due to domestic factors, which we can talk about a little bit later. But the trade dispute with the United States is an important factor. And so resolving this trade dispute would certainly boost confidence among Chinese consumers, entrepreneurs, and also Chinese investors in their own stock market. And so I think there's a desire to do this. Also, it would remove a potential distraction for Xi Jinping. Because I think Xi Jinping understands that if there's a deal when the two of them meet in Korea later this month, Donald Trump is likely to come back to the United States and work hard to make that deal a success. And that will include, in my view, calling off his hawks, people in his administration throughout the MAGA world who are very strongly anti-China. I expect he will ask them to tone it down dramatically, like he's already done. Think about this. Peter Navarro, the chief China critic in the Trump White House, has just disappeared in recent weeks. And I assume this is because the president has asked him to take a break to not interfere in the environment for a meeting with Xi Jinping. So this will help calm things down in the United States, which will make life easier for Chinese companies. And the other important factor is that if there isn't a deal, if it blows up, Trump comes back mad at China and at Xi Jinping, he might then unleash his China hawks. And that could create real problems for Chinese companies trying to do business in the United States and around the rest of the world.
Andy, who do you think has the better cards going into this meeting?
Well, I certainly disagree with Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent when he says that the Trump administration holds all the cards. It's pretty clear that he knows better than that. It's pretty clear that they recognize that China has some significant cards. The two most obvious ones are soybeans and rare earths. China has traditionally, for many years, been one of the largest purchasers of American soybeans. And so far this year, in the harvest that's just getting underway right now, they've signed 0 contracts for 0 beans. This is already starting to have a substantial negative impact on American farmers. The other one that we're all familiar with is rare earths, because China dominates the processing and manufacturing of rare earths materials. And these are important for everything from cars. The last time they cut this off in response to the Trump tariffs, Ford had to shut down production for a few weeks. But it's also really important for U.S. weapon systems. Everything from the F-35 to our nuclear submarines have a lot of rare earth materials in them, and they generally come via China. So those are two of the biggest cards. But Washington has cards too. They can make life complicated for China, but only to a limited extent. So the tariffs, I mentioned before, about 58%. Well, sure, that's hurt Chinese exports to the United States. They're down about 17% year over year in dollar terms. But Chinese companies have been really clever about finding other markets. And so overall Chinese exports this year are up, including to the United States, are up 6%. So I think it's a fairly balanced deal. But if you had asked me to pick who has the best cards, I'd say right now it's probably China.
What kind of deal would this be? What do you see as the major elements that would make both parties happy?
Well, let me first say that I think there's a 70% chance of a deal coming out of the meeting between the two leaders on the margins of APEC in Korea at the end of this month. That's a relatively high percentage for anything that the Trump administration is heading into. But still a 30% chance that it blows up. And one of the reasons for that is that President Trump tends to be somewhat mercurial. If he's having a bad day, or if he reads something bad in the press from China, that could get derailed. Also, there hasn't been the level of preparatory work between the two sides that we would normally see heading into a summit like this. So that means that in a relatively brief period of time when the two meet, they're going to have to cover a lot of ground. And that's hard. Still, 70% is not bad. What's the deal going to look like? Let's be realistic. This is not going to be a deal that resolves all or even most of the substantial problems in the bilateral relationship between the United States and China. There's kind of two ends of the spectrum here. The bottom end of the spectrum, the least exciting part, is a deal which is basically a continuation of the status quo right now, a rollover of the only 58% tariff instead of the 135% tariff, maybe a pledge by the United States to stop adding more export controls on Chinese goods and companies, and a pledge from China to continue selling rare earths and to resume buying soybeans from American farmers. And the sweetener from China will be, yeah, sure, President Trump, you can have TikTok. We don't really care about TikTok since it doesn't actually operate in China. That would be kind of the low end of the spectrum. The higher end of the spectrum would cover more things and would be couched in more long-term language. An agreement that the two sides will not continue to have a call and response system of rising export controls, whether it's on rare earths or it's on semiconductors or equipment to make semiconductors. An agreement to tone down the rhetoric and an agreement to try and cooperate more. And that would include the things I already mentioned, like soybeans and rare earths, but it would also include a pledge by the Chinese to buy more Boeing airplanes. Like with soybeans, it's in their interest. They need soybeans. They're the world's largest importer of soybeans. They rely on imports to feed their animals. They need Boeing airplanes. They don't want to rely just on Airbus. So that would be a natural thing for them to agree to. From Xi Jinping's side, I think he would ask Donald Trump to also back off on some of the pressure that his administration is putting on third countries. For example, his Commerce Department is putting pressure on Vietnam to reduce the level of imports of components and raw materials from China that go into Vietnam's exports. For example, just recently, the US put pressure on the Dutch government, which resulted in them effectively taking over a Chinese semiconductor company's operations in Holland. These are the kinds of things that the Chinese side would be asking the US to stop. Those, I think, would be the main elements of the deal.
Andy, you touched a little bit on, I don't want to get off the track, but TikTok seems to be something that, just is out there. And I don't think most people, especially the young people in the US, understand the relationship between the Chinese government, TikTok, the US, the shareholding. Can you just touch on TikTok a little bit before we get back? Because I think it's something that most people that really don't understand the whole dynamics of this TikTok thing, that would be really.
Well, I can try, but I gotta confess, I don't really understand TikTok either. I'm not on TikTok. I have never used TikTok, and I'm not well versed in the details of the ownership. But let's say the basics are that TikTok is widely used, as you know, in the United States. For many young people in the U.S., it is a primary source of news. And Donald Trump, who in his first administration described TikTok as a national security threat and signed an executive order which was supposed to lead to the banning of the operation of TikTok in the United States or force them to sell it to the United States, now says, as I mentioned before, I got a warm spot in my heart for TikTok because he believes that he won the youth vote based on his campaign's use of TikTok videos. It's possible. But one of the issues has been that because TikTok's U.S. operations are controlled by its parent company, ByteDance, which is a Chinese-owned company, there is a view by some in the United States that it is being manipulated, that the algorithms are being manipulated by the Chinese government to force Americans to believe something that's not true. I'm not aware of anybody coming up with any evidence to show that that's happened. I also think that young people in America are smarter than that, that if the TikTok algorithms were being manipulated to show them stuff that is false and that they weren't really interested in, they wouldn't just consume it because it's on TikTok. And I think this is one of the reasons why Donald Trump is willing to say, yeah, let's do a deal. In theory, Donald Trump has said that the deal's already done. Chinese side hasn't agreed to this, but Trump is going into the meeting, I think, with a high expectation that he's going to come away with TikTok. What this means, we don't know. Will TikTok's operations be controlled by an American company? Will the control of the algorithm switch from a Chinese-controlled company to a large U.S. tech firm-controlled company? Possibly. Will that make us safer? I don't know. Will the algorithm continue to be maintained and upgraded by China? If not, are American companies capable of doing this successfully? If it's that easy, why hasn't a U.S. company already created its own version of TikTok to compete with it? So I think there's a lot of unknowns, but I do believe that if China thinks it's getting a reasonably fair deal out of whatever deal comes up, TikTok's an easy one for them to agree to give away.
Andy, it seems to me that this deal is quite favorable to Xi. He would be very happy with this. He really doesn't give up anything, and he gains a lot of time, which is what he wants. He wants more time to achieve his objectives in China. Does that make sense? Is he playing Trump here? Is this like sort of falling into place to where he would like to see it happen?
I tend to look at it from a slightly different perspective. I don't think Xi Jinping is playing Trump. I think that Donald Trump is probably recognizing that his approach to dealing with China, as well as the Biden administration's approach to dealing with China, is counterproductive for the United States. And so he is backing away from some elements of that approach that aren't working for America. Tariffs are not going to solve any of the problems that the US feels it has in its own economy or in its relationship with China. It's just not. We also know historically that export controls designed to pull the rug out from under China's technological development just don't work. There's a long list of semiconductor engineers and scientists who've been making this point today. If we go back historically and look at the times when the US has tried to do this in the past, say with export controls designed to prevent the Chinese from developing their own nuclear weapons back in the 50s, didn't work. It didn't work with space launch. It didn't work with GPS. Hasn't worked with semiconductors. Sure, you can slow down Chinese progress, but I think the evidence tells us that the more the US focuses on trying to constrain China, rather than focusing on building up our own industries and science and running faster at home, the more we try to trip up China, the more we accelerate their own domestic innovation. And we're seeing that now in the semiconductor space. So this is a good thing for us to stop and say, this isn't good for us.
Yeah, but Xi doesn't give up anything, right? He basically maintains the status quo. He gives up TikTok, which he doesn't care about, and which Trump thinks is a huge victory. So for him, if his sort of long-term objective is, to gain more prominence in frontier industries and to build up his military, this just gives him more time to do that, right? So he doesn't give up anything, and he gets more time to develop his initiatives.
That's one way to look at it. Another way is that the US government started this fight and is now realizing that it's not a fight that they can win. And so it's in the US's interest to call off the fight. And sure, Xi Jinping wins too, but should we ask Xi Jinping to make other concessions because the US approach has been faulty? What would those concessions be? I think that this is an opportunity for all of us to sit back and say, has the approach that we've been taking to China over the last 15 or 20 years, not just under the Trump administration, is this an approach that makes sense for America? Do we want to decide that the world's second largest economy and possibly the second strongest military is an adversary, and there's nothing we can do to turn an adversarial relationship into a more constructive and cooperative relationship? Is that the conclusion that we want to reach? Is that the best solution for the United States over the next 50 or 100 years? So I think that the victory for us of diffusing this trade war is a reckoning back here of we need a much better approach.
Well, what would you recommend the US do?
Well, the first key thing is to stop assuming that there's an adversarial relationship between China and the United States. So there's nothing we can do about it other than prepare for conflict. Because that's kind of the basis of most of the policies that have been in place over the last several administrations, not just this one. Then we need to figure out what are the real problems in the relationship. Do we really want to focus on the size of the bilateral trade deficit? I mean, as you guys know, as economists or investors, it's ridiculous, right? It's not an important issue. So what do we want to focus on? What really do we want China to do differently? And what should we do differently? So I think the first thing we need to do is, if we're really worried about competition with China, is get our own act together. Let's use this opportunity the way that the Eisenhower administration used Sputnik to get our own house in order back then, right? What are we doing today? Worried about competition from China? We're cutting central government funding for science, for R&D, for education. We are pulling up the welcome mat for foreign students who have been hugely important contributors to innovation and entrepreneurship in the United States. At the same time, under Xi Jinping, since he became head of the party in 2012, there's been like a 6 or 7 CAGR increase in Chinese government central spending on education and R&D. And they are putting out the welcome mat for scientists in the United States who feel unwelcome or who are finding they can't get on NIH grants. On clean tech, we're all excited about what's happening in AI and quantum computers. Those obviously require a tremendous amount of energy. And what are we doing here in the United States? We're pulling the plug on research and building of clean tech, of renewable power sources, of funding for battery research. In China, they're going completely the opposite direction. Here's a statistic that blows my mind. If you look at all of the utility scale wind and solar construction underway globally, 3/4 of it is in China.
But Andy, one of the things, I guess I'm going to give you a little pushback, is that, and you can tell me if I'm right or wrong about these statistics. From what I understand, China has no choice because I think the statistics are, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that only 20% of the fresh water is even drinkable. The pollution, as you know this is the truth, that the pollution that has occurred over the last 30 years since this industrial revolution in China has really hurt the ecosystem, right? The farming, so I don't think China has any chance, has any choice to do it. That's a positive thing, but are they doing it as a reaction to, they really believe that renewable energy is the future, or are they doing it in a reaction to the fact that their country's so polluted that they have no choice? Because anyway, what's your thought on that push? Kind of a pushback, but where do you land on that?
Yeah, I don't think that's a pushback. I think that those are two of the factors that are driving them. But there's also a third factor, which is that they're heavily dependent on imported fossil fuels. And they want to reduce that too for strategic purposes. But that's fine. This is, a government in a country that's operating in its own self-interest. So yeah, think back to, let's say, the 1960s and 70s, when we made massive investments in the United States because pollution in the United States was horrible, right? And so we really made a huge difference. China's done the same thing. So as you mentioned, I first went to China as a student in 1980. I went back to work there as an American diplomat in 84. I spent more than 20 years there. The pollution, water pollution, air pollution, soil pollution, food pollution was horrible. But it is so dramatically better now. They've built out massively the public infrastructure, and part of this is one of the reasons why they've been pushing for renewables, including EVs. But that's okay. That's a good reason for doing it. I wish we were that motivated. Our pollution levels have come down dramatically from the 60s and 70s, but it's not like it doesn't exist.
Andy, the Chinese, they think very long term. They're very engineering focused, very technocratic, and they're delivering on all their long-term plans, actually quite remarkably. China 2025 is a huge success, and they keep on moving in that direction. And then, as you described very well, the US is doing the absolute opposite, right? We're like going in the wrong direction. So if these two countries are in a Cold War, I mean, who's winning this thing? To me, it sounds like the Chinese are they're way ahead. It's not even close. What do you think?
Well, I would argue that we're not in a Cold War. I would argue that we're in a period now where our political leadership has kind of lost its mind over China, that China's become the boogeyman, that our political system always needs to have a boogeyman. And right now it's China. And a lot of the criticism and commentary that I hear out of Washington is just not based on fact, on reality, and it's being driven by way too many people who've never spent any time in China, or if they've gone there for a few days, they've only sat down and met with government officials who've yelled at them for a couple hours and then they've come home. We need to have a more thoughtful approach to dealing with the problem, but I don't think we're in a Cold War. Our economic and cultural business relationships, science relationships are all too intertwined, interconnected, and interdependent. So that's not, to me, the sign of a Cold War. But I would also push back on your characterization, which is kind of like the Chinese have been omniscient and totally successful in all this stuff they've been doing. I think that actually goes too far. They have been incredibly successful. Again, dating myself, when I first started working in China, the place was a basket case. It was poor, pollution was terrible. If you had asked me when I was a junior U.S. diplomat in Guangzhou in 1984, 85, if I would then 25 years later be working in the financial industry on China, I would have said, no chance. I mean, this was not an economy that was moving in any positive direction. So the change has been phenomenal, not only on the economics, but on health, on literacy, infant mortality, on grain yields. They really made things work. But they didn't get it 100% right for sure. The boom in industry is what led to this horrible pollution problem that we're talking about. There are lots of other issues. Inequality in China is continuing to rise within urban areas and between urban and rural. One of the things that's been great in China in the last few decades is a sense of upward mobility, the kind of sense that we used to enjoy in the United States, where almost everybody thought their kids were going to have a better life than they had. Now, I'm not sure if even half of Americans feel that way, but in China, most people do, but the percentage of that is starting to come down. There's a lot of issues. They have an industrial policy which has worked really well in helping create an environment for private entrepreneurial companies to generate incredible discoveries in areas like batteries and EVs and AI and quantum and biotech. But it also has negative consequences, like most industrial policies. It fuels excess investment and overcapacity, which is putting pressure on industrial profits right now. So I don't want to characterize this as they've been 100% successful, but they've done a pretty good job, and we can learn some things from what they've done. And in fact, if you listen to people in Washington right now, there's a lot of talk about using the Chinese industrial policy as a model for ours, which is kind of interesting. The other thing that I want to highlight, sorry, Jim, is how much more personal freedom Chinese people have as a result of this undertaking. Again, to use my own personal experience, when I was first working in China in the early 80s, the Chinese Communist Party controlled every aspect of everybody's life. They told people where to live. No one owned their own home in Chinese cities. Where to go to school, what to study. When you graduated, they assigned you to a job with the state. There were no private companies back then. You couldn't even find a privately owned restaurant. If you wanted to travel to another city inside China, you needed a chit from the party. Going abroad was really, really hard. All of the information flow, this is pre-internet, was controlled by the party. If you wanted to get married, you had to request permission from the party to marry a particular person. All those things I just described no longer apply. So the personal freedom for people to run their life as they choose has just expanded so dramatically in a relatively short period of time. This is one of the reasons why it's really surprising for most Americans that Chinese people are generally pretty content with their government, because the government has delivered those personal freedoms in addition to an improvement in standard of living. Now, I keep saying personal freedom because there's no political freedom in China. Don't get me wrong. But in terms of economic and personal freedom, the change has been phenomenal in a relatively short period of time. And we need to understand that this is important to Chinese people. There's more that needs to be done, of course.
Well, there's no question that China had probably the greatest economic miracle ever. There's no other country. There have been other economic miracles, but nothing of this scale and success. It's been absolutely amazing. But since Xi came in 2012, I think, didn't he set? I mean, he has several things he really cared about, which I think he's delivered on. The first, the increasing self-reliance. So they've made very good progress on that, and they continue to go much. They want to go much further in self-reliance. And then the China 2025, the frontier industries, where they're having very significant progress, right? And he continues on this path. I think they're going to announce the new sort of China 35 soon, right? And it's going to be more of the same. And my thinking is that this is really what matters to him. These things, this technological development, self-reliance, and part of self-reliance is building up the military, which the Chinese have done also wonderfully well. And I wonder if economic growth in itself and the popularity with the masses is of any importance to Xi. If he really cares about economic growth, if he can still achieve his objectives, which is self-reliance and dominating tech industries.
I think all of those things are interconnected, and I believe that the end result is that Xi Jinping cares tremendously about a growing economy and a stable social environment, because he can't achieve all of those other things that you talked about if there's domestic turmoil. Sometimes I hear people say there is a conflict in Xi Jinping's head between, on the one hand, security, on the other hand, economics. I don't buy that. I think for almost every country in the world, the most important national security issue is at home, right? It's domestic stability. Xi Jinping remembers 1989. He does not want to have to bring tanks back out again. So when you look at a country that, for example, over about a 15-year period, raised the minimum wage for factory workers by more than 10% every year, that put pressure on companies, but it was designed to boost the standard of living, generate faster income growth, generate more consumption. So if we look at the build out of the social safety net, public education, spending on that has been growing at very rapid rates, both before and during Xi Jinping's period as head of the party. Now, again, not to say there aren't problems and they shouldn't be doing a lot more on all these things, for sure. But I think that I don't see any reason to believe that he isn't super focused on improving the economy and standard of living and optimism to maintain social stability so that the country moves in the right direction. If most people are poor and unhappy, having the best battery makers in the world doesn't really help very much.
So you disagree with the views of Michael Pettis, the controversial Beijing University professor, who says that it's sort of that the Chinese are engineering this low level of household consumption, basically to achieve their objectives. You would disagree with that fully?
Yes. Yeah, I think that there is no evidence that the Chinese leadership, including under Xi Jinping, is anti-consumption, anti-consumer. So there's two kind of charts you can look at on this story. One chart shows you that as a share of GDP, final consumption in China is extraordinarily low. But then you have to stop and say, why is that? Is it because the government is deliberately suppressing consumption? My view is that they had a strategy. And that strategy was back at the beginning of the reform and opening process. When I was first in China, the infrastructure in China was a disaster. Power didn't work. Phones didn't work. When I was at the U.S. Embassy consulate in Guangzhou in the early 80s, we had bicycle messengers because the phone lines were so unreliable. I suggested to my boss that we get messenger pigeons, but that they, like many of my suggestions back then, they turned me down. Now I traveled in rural Tibet, in the middle of nowhere, and I had better cell service than I have in my house at Berkeley. So they had a plan, which was to build out infrastructure, and as a result, investment as a share of GDP grew at an incredibly fast pace, and in recent years off of a very high base. So that crowded out the share of GDP or GDP growth coming from consumption. But the second chart you can look at shows you the growth rate of final consumption in China compared to the growth rate of final consumption, say, in the United States or Japan. And what you'll see is for the last 15, 20 years, the growth rate of consumption in China is way faster than it is in our country. But we're turning around a super tanker in terms of the share. What we saw in the years pre-COVID was that consumption was driving a steadily bigger share of GDP growth. That hasn't been the case since COVID. But this is not, I think, the result of a deliberate strategy to depress consumption in China. It's that confidence collapsed in China, according to the Chinese government's own survey of consumer sentiment, which remarkably, even though the data is terrible, they continue to publish it every month. It collapsed during the Shanghai COVID lockdown and really hasn't recovered. We're starting to see a little bit of a pickup. The August number, the most recent one we have, was the highest in 17 months. But this is the big problem, and this is not something that the government's happy about.
Andy, when you look at, when you take it, like, say, from the outside in, looking in, especially for someone who's been looking at China for a long time from an investment standpoint, I mean, you look at Xi Jinping's track record, okay? You obviously, everything you said was correct, but also the realization is this: he's presided over the worst stock market in the history of modern China, maybe the worst economic drop in real estate, which has been the driver of the Chinese economy for 30 years. Real estate is dead. So here's a guy who has, who again, the two main assets of Chinese investors, real estate and stocks, are in the doldrums. Consumer, as you said, it's picking up, but this is one of the reasons that consumer confidence is very low. I can make a case that that he's only hanging on because he got rid of his opponents. But at the end of the day, I mean, if you look at the Chinese Politburo, they're not communist, they're actually pragmatists. I mean, why is this guy still around? I mean, I'll be honest. Why is he? Why one day he should just be gone? Because if you look at what he's done to the Chinese economy, what he's done to things that mattered for the Chinese consumer and the investor, it's been a disaster. So how has this guy survived, Andy? And how will he continue to survive when there's no except for the internet stocks and some of the real estate's dead, the stock market's dead. So how is this guy surviving, and how will he continue to survive?
Yeah, so you raised a lot of good points, and you'll remember that a few minutes ago I said we shouldn't give him too much credit for being omniscient and doing everything perfectly, because there have been a lot of problems, and you highlighted two of them. The stock market up until this year has been a disaster for investors. This year, it's worth noting that the Shanghai Composite Index is outperforming the S&P 500. And the Hong Kong exchange, which is primarily Chinese companies, is doing even better than that. So there has been an improvement there. The residential property market is a disaster in the sense that new home prices are down, somewhere between 20 and 30% on average from the 2021 peak. And while this is a key contributor to the fall in confidence, compare the impact of the crisis in the Chinese property market with what we went through in the late 2000s? It's nothing, because the Chinese regulators were much more careful than we were. They learned a lot from us. So even though house prices are down that much, you're not reading about foreclosures and people losing their home. You're not reading about spillover into the banking system, which is leading to a financial rescue. There are problems, but because up until recently they were requiring people to put down 30% cash for a new home that was going to be a primary residence, much higher if it was an investment property. Now it's 20%. There were no doc loans, ninja loans, those kinds of things. When I lived in China, I owned a few properties and had mortgages with Chinese banks. I can tell you that the due diligence process for those mortgage applications was way more intensive and intrusive than anything I've been through in the United States. You know, I was working for CLSA at that time, and while I was applying for one of the mortgages, a guy from the bank showed up at the CLSA office in Shanghai and said, "Hey, I just wanted to actually confirm with my own eyes that you work here." And so I said, "Well, my paycheck from CLSA has been direct deposited into your bank for years now." And he's like, "Yeah, we know, but we just want to make sure." But if you're asking, is the average person in China reasonably content with the government leadership? I would say yes, because while you ran off a list of important things, and I'd add one more problem that's really important in China now, which is that according to the official government statistics, the youth unemployment rate in China is about 19%. So there's a lot of problems there. But especially for older people who remember how bad things were when I was first there, or even beyond that in the 70s, life is so much better now. Could it be better than that? For sure. And then, from a political perspective, you always have to ask, okay, if not Xi Jinping, then who? Who's the obvious candidate who has a better plan? And obviously, when I say candidate, it's not a democracy. But I think that we also have to recognize that while things are weak now, they haven't fallen off a cliff. Let me give you a couple of numbers to illustrate that. If we look at inflation-adjusted per capita income growth in China prior to COVID, the 5 years prior to COVID in 2020, the growth rate was 6.7% a year. The last 5 years, it's been 4.9. So a significant slowdown, but it's still almost 5% growth in inflation-adjusted income. As a result, consumption growth before COVID was averaging 7.6%. Last 5 years, it's been 4.8. Year to date this year, it's 4.7. So, it is not great, but it isn't the kind of collapse that some of the media headlines in the United States might lead you to believe.
Well, why is business confidence so low, and why is consumer confidence so low? And why have so many multinationals sort of, decided they can't deal with China? So there's been a retreat from a lot of companies. It doesn't seem, it seems to contradict your more positive view on consumption.
Yeah, I think that, again, consumption is weak. If you look at the retail sales numbers for September that were just published, they're really weak. You look at bar and restaurant sales, they're down dramatically. Part of that is the anti-corruption campaign. Part of it is just people are more pessimistic than they were before. And I think it's a combination of things. Most of it, I would say, is the result of bad policy design and bad policy execution by the government and by local governments across China over the last 5 or 6 years. This is not new. Like all governments, they make a lot of mistakes, but what has been different in China this time is that the leadership has been more stubborn, and it's taken them a lot longer to acknowledge their policy mistakes and course correct. But one of the reasons that I think that consumer survey data, while weak, is improving now gradually, is that last September, the leadership finally woke up and realized that the mistakes they had made were quite serious and started talking and acting differently. So, I lived there for more than 20 years. I go back regularly. Um, I've been back now 9 times since the lifting of the COVID travel restrictions. Through my trip a year, say last May, the level of pessimism was just off the charts. Government officials, private economists, business people. But when I went back last October, a year ago, that had changed significantly. And that was because there was a leadership meeting, a Politburo meeting in September, where the change in rhetoric about the direction of the economy changed significantly. And they started to make some incremental policy changes. They acknowledged that the policy pendulum had swung way too far in one direction. Now, it's not coming back the other way as fast as I would like it to, or as many people I speak to, but the sense of confidence on the ground has been improving on each one of my trips since last October, including last month, both because policies are now moving in the right direction, rhetoric is moving, also because of the successes in the tech sector, starting with DeepSeek and Huawei and others. Also, a feeling of resilience in the face of the Trump tariffs. When I was in China in April, right after Trump's tariff announcement, his Liberation Day press conference, there was a lot of anxiety in China about what the impact was going to be. But now it's like, hey, we got this. The export numbers show this, but just a feeling like China's gonna muddle through this, and that the pain of the tariffs is going to be greater on the U.S. consumer and companies than it is on Chinese consumers and companies. And then, of course, that has led to this improvement in the stock market, which is then reverberated back to accelerate confidence. So things are slowly starting to get better.
What are you telling your corporate clients on what they should be doing in the Chinese market, and what are they telling you?
So you raised the issue of multinationals, which I didn't address a moment ago. So let me briefly do that. And when I travel to China, I focus more on talking to Chinese companies than I do foreign companies. But I do meet with some foreign companies, and I think it's important to recognize that it's been really hard to do business in China. Part of it has been government regulations, which are discriminatory against foreign companies. And some companies have left because of that. But when I talk to the multinationals, and most major multinationals are still in China, when I talk to them, the biggest complaint I hear is not about the government. It's about how tough competition is there. A lot of foreign companies, including American companies, are making good money in China. But because of the political environment in the United States right now, nobody wants to talk about that.
Andy, as we wrap things up, I guess it's an important thing, given your background. Can you just comment, if you can, on what do you think? I mean, I guess everyone's trying to figure out what is China's strategy towards Taiwan. What are they going to do? Everyone says 2027. I mean, nobody knows. What do you think the thinking about Taiwan is from the top, and then obviously from the man on the street? Both two perspectives, please.
Sure, good questions. And you mentioned that I spent a couple of years in the mid 1990s when I was a foreign service officer as the Taiwan desk officer at the State Department in Washington. That was when Li Donghui, the first democratically elected president of Taiwan, came to the United States, and the Chinese response was firing missiles over Taiwan. So that experience has a big impact on how I view this. I would argue that for the man in the street in China, this is just not an issue. The vast majority of people in China believe that Taiwan is already part of China, because that's what they've been taught in school. That's what they read about in the media. And it's just not a big issue for them. It's not something most people think about. When I go back to China, I usually go to Beijing and Shanghai, but I also try and stop in someplace else, the equivalent of Middle America. So on my April trip, I spent a couple of days in the city of Xiamen, which most of your listeners probably haven't heard of, but it's got a population bigger than Los Angeles, and it's right on the coast across from Taiwan. In fact, one night I was having dinner with some local folks at a seafood restaurant on the beach, and you could kind of see one of the outer islands of Taiwan right offshore. And these people go back and forth all the time for tourism, for business. But, looking in the beach that night, I didn't see the military. What I saw were lots of couples having their wedding pictures taken out on that beach in front of Taiwan. From the government's perspective, I think that the hyper anti-China environment in Washington right now is leading to a lot of hysterical analysis. For example, you mentioned 2027, this idea that Xi Jinping has set a deadline for taking control of Taiwan or using force. That just came out of thin air from a U.S. admiral who was head of the U.S. Pacific Forces, about to retire, and was asked by a senator at a hearing about what China's ambitions were. And he said, it's possible that by 2027, Xi Jinping wants to have unification or use force. That's it. All because of this one guy. But there's no evidence to back that up. You can cherry pick phrases from speeches and cobble them together out of context and say, this indicates that they want to do that. But I would argue that there is no evidence to support the idea that Xi Jinping is getting ready to use force. And there's no domestic pressure to do this, as I was saying before. The military risks would be huge. If he was going to invade Taiwan, this would be D-Day on steroids. Think about how much Putin has been struggling when he just had to send tanks and trucks and infantry over a land border. This is about 100 miles of really difficult water on only a handful of beaches where you can land, and everybody knows where they are. You have no idea what the U.S. response is going to be. If Xi Jinping was to get bogged down on an invasion, he would go down as the worst leader in the history of China. Why would he want to take that risk? We're talking about a PLA that has been expanding and modernizing, but hasn't fought a war in a really long time. It's untested. Nobody's done an amphibious assault like this, I think, since Korean War. So, and then people would say, well, maybe they'll do like a blockade or a quarantine like during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But when I've spoken to people in our Navy about this, they're pretty dismissive of that generally, arguing that you just run the risk of starting a war that way. Because what happens when a ship tries to run the blockade, or if the U.S. Navy tries to help a tanker with oil or a ship with food run that? Sure, Xi Jinping could lob missiles at Taiwan and destroy it, but to what end? Those are Chinese people living on Taiwan. Also, I would argue that if he was getting ready to do this, we would see signs of this from our satellites, from our signal intelligence. They would be moving troops and material from all around China to the coast off of Taiwan. They would be ramping up production of trucks and boats and ammunition. They would be getting ready, the healthcare system ready for mass casualties. They'd be rolling out propaganda to get people ready for a lot of pain. None of that's happening now. And then there's the economic side. Russia is not especially globally integrated, but China is. China really depends on imports for things like oil, LNG, iron ore, and semiconductors. Most of the semiconductors consumed in China are imported. All of the most sophisticated ones are, and they come from Taiwan. And there's zero chance that China can just take the TSMC fabs and operate themselves, because a lot of those engineers have US passports. They'd be out right away. A lot of the components, raw materials, chemicals are imported from Western countries, and they need constant maintenance and upkeep from Western engineers, which would all stop. So there's just a lot of reasons why this doesn't make any sense. And I do not hear people in China telling me that they're getting ready for the use of force.
There has been rumors that, or comments that Xi would like a commitment from Trump on Taiwan. Do you have any notion what that might be, or what is that important to Xi? Is that required for him to agree to a deal?
When I was in Beijing last month and I asked people about this, almost everybody said that they thought that Xi Jinping was unlikely to raise Taiwan in this upcoming meeting with Trump. It's going to be a relatively brief meeting, and the thinking was that Xi was going to keep it focused on trade and economic issues. That said, Taiwan usually comes up in bilateral meetings between China and the United States. So what would he ask? The Wall Street Journal had a story saying that some people were telling the reporter that Xi Jinping was going to ask Donald Trump to change the U.S. rhetoric, which it has for many, many years been that the U.S. does not support Taiwan independence, that Xi would ask Trump to change that to the U.S. is opposed to Taiwan independence. It's not a huge shift to the United States. Obviously, it would be somewhat of a political victory for Xi Jinping. How important is it to him? Maybe a little bit. But I do not think he's going to ask Donald Trump to hand over the keys to Taiwan, to stop the economic and military relationship that's been running for decades. I don't think Trump would want to go there. We also have to consider the possibility that Donald Trump, when he arrives in Korea, is going to be basking in the glow of his apparent success in Gaza and may offer to Xi Jinping, hey, I solved the Middle East war. Why don't you let me mediate unification with China and Taiwan?
Right.
I've heard people say that when Donald Trump was in Beijing as president in his first term, that he made a similar offer and it was just ignored. But that wouldn't completely surprise me if Trump was to, because that would definitely be a lock on the Nobel Peace Prize, right? But I do not think that either Taiwan issues or Ukraine-Putin issues are likely to blow up a potential deal on trade and economic issues.
Andy, this has been amazing. What are your socials? If people want to follow you, do you actively post? What are your socials? I'll post them in, but tell everyone your socials, and then we'll wrap it up.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, I'm most active on LinkedIn. So if you follow me there, I publish my longer pieces there, but also short commentary on a regular basis. I have a website with the longer pieces, which is synologyllc.com. And those are the main outlets. I'm also on Substack under the auspices of Kaiser Gross publishing arm.
Awesome. I'll post everything down. Andy, this has been incredible. I mean, really interesting, especially with this meeting coming up. And we want to thank you very much for spending some time with us.
Okay. I should also note then, if you're given the opportunity, that I'm available to advise institutional investors on the kinds of issues that we've been talking about today.
100%.
Thank you very much, Andy.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you, guys. Great to join you.